No one has tribalized America quite like Barack Obama in the years of my life. The idea that Barack Obama is some sort of halcyon of uniting rhetoric is absolute turd. It's not true whatsoever. And then he said somewhere in here that Congress, he hoped, would have the courage not to do what's politically expedient, but to do deep in our heart what we know is right. He said, Congress people should, quote, recognize it takes little courage to aid those who are already powerful, already comfortable, already influential. It takes some courage to champion the vulnerable and the sick and the infirm, those who often have no access to the corridors of power. This is such crap. Every demagogue in history has said this. Okay, the idea that it takes courage to champion the little guy. It takes no courage to champion the little guy. It also takes no courage to champion the big guy. You know what it takes courage to do? To tell the truth to both the little guy and to the big guy. The idea that it takes courage to sit around talking about how the poor have it rough, that does not take courage. You know what takes courage? Telling people stuff they don't want to hear. Kevin Williamson wrote a great column over at National Review over the weekend about how there's an entire mentality that exists in parts of the country where people feel that they are passive observers in their own life and not responsible for any of the things that they do in their own life. So, you know, they are evicted. It's not that they did stuff to lead them to being evicted. They are evicted. Or they have a bad job. Okay, they don't have a bad job. They got a bad job because they didn't make good decisions about their education in many cases. This idea that everybody is a victim, okay, this is something that is promulgated in politics. The idea that it takes courage to promulgate a victim narrative about how some people in America are screwing other people in America, that is not courage. Courage is doing what Ted Cruz did in Iowa during the last election cycle and campaigning for the presidency in Iowa, the first state, by saying, I'm not going to give you subsidies because ethanol is a boondoggle. That's political courage. Okay, political courage is actually Donald Trump saying to members of the black community, guys, the problem here ain't the police. The problem here is the gangs. Okay, that takes political courage. It takes political courage to say things that are not popular. And it is always popular to say, oh, look at the poor guy. The poor guy's getting screwed. That's always the easy thing to say. For Obama to pretend otherwise, to pretend like, oh, he has serious courage for saying that poor people ought to have health care. Of course, poor people ought to have health care. Everybody ought to have health care. In a free market system, that's the only way that poor people are ever going to be able to afford good health care. Everybody not ought to have health care. Everybody ought to be able to have health care that they can afford and work for and don't demand at the point of gun from somebody else. Freedom still matters. And quality of health care still matters. Basically, all that redistributionism does is it freezes time and redistributes resources. That's all redistributionism does. Socialism freezes what you have right now and redistributes it, and then it starts to fade. Okay, that's what happens in medicine too. Socialism just freezes things and then redistributes them. Free markets grow things. Okay, that's why it's harsher. Right? It's a harder world in capitalism than it is in socialism. But only in the short term, certainly not in the long term, which is why we live better now than we did 20 years ago, and socialist countries live worse now than they did 30 years ago.